к нам пришел парень, который очень хорошо пародирует девушек. Ладно, это просто Джеки. В гостях. Протеиновая, да.
Мексиканский стейк. Буррито.
This would be a video that unfortunately marked the end of Denis 10's life, just less than 2 hours after the video was posted on his Instagram. Olympic figure skating medalist, Denis 10, was stabbed to death right on the street of the city of Almaty, Kazakhstan. But Denis 10's life has been brutally cut short, in horrific scenes in his homeland, which have drawn interest from around the globe. His family, friends, and fans have been devastated by the news. Unbeknownst to them, what actually happened to the gentle soul athlete, and what led him to his brutal attack. However, the accident is still unknown to the public. But who was behind the horrific murder that afternoon?
Denis 10, a Kazakh figure skater of Korean descent and former Olympic bronze medalist, has been stabbed to death at the age of 25. Our Cheshi Young has more details.
This is Denis 10, who was the first skater from Kazakhstan to stand on the podium at the World Championships, Four Continents Championships, Asian Winter Games, and the Olympic Games. A vibrant, free-spirited, and cheerful, 25-year-old who had his whole life ahead of him. Denis 10 was born on the 13th of June, 1993, and had an older brother, Alexei 10, to his Mongolian Kazakh parents, Oksana 10, and Yuri 10, growing up in the busiest city of Almaty, Kazakhstan, where has a population of over 2 million. It was once the main capital of Kazakhstan, from 1929 to 1936, while the country was an autonomous republic of the Soviet Union, and finally from 1991, an independent state. At the age of 9, he was also proud of being the youngest member, in a boys' choir that won the silver medal, at the World Choir Games, in Korea in 2002. Before his skating career took off, Denis has enrolled in music school for 5 years, and also around this time, he tried taekwondo, karate, tennis, swimming, in the first few years of his life. But it was his mother, who advised pursuing figure skating. Fortunately, this decision proved to be the right one, as he has achieved immense success in the figure skating sport, in its initial stages. Denis's abilities were not just a hobby, far beyond his skating. He was also known as a graduate, who has excelled in his studies with a Kazakh Red Diploma, at the Kazakh Academy of Sports and Tourism in May 2014. By 2015, he began working on his MBA program, at the Business School of the Kazakh British Technical University. Being originally from a family of Mongolian descent, it's really no surprise that he showed a deep love for figure skating from a very early age, even though Kazakhstan is a country that quite unfamiliar to figure skating. Now, Denis was nurturing ambitions for himself, to be a widely known figure skater. The problem is highly improbable in Kazakhstan, where seems not to be qualified for his training at the time. Then he moved to shopping malls, which had ice surfaces that weren't exactly Olympic size. Every Friday, the malls would stage an ice exhibition, and Tin would perform for all of the shopaholics. He didn't feel frustrated by the meager conditions. But even so, in the hope that he would take his skating career to a new level in his homeland. And that going hand in hand with, he describes how his training, in Almaty, as a brave warrior for an initial harsh training period, in an interview at the 2013 Worlds, Tin himself recalls. When I started skating in Kazakhstan, we only had open air rinks, and could only skate in the winter. We had a very cold winter, so, I remember my mother putting 3 pairs of pants on me, and I looked like a cabbage. Like many other modern figure skaters, Tin has had to travel far from his beginnings, to explore the boundaries of his talent. So by 2003, he decided to travel to Omsk, in southwest Siberia, Russia for a skating competition, in which he won. The Russian head judge, Alexander Kogan, who would later invite him to another competition in Odintsovo, Moscow region, where Tin met a Russian coach, named Elena Buyanova, who recognized his talent immediately, when he was only 13 years old. He began training camp with her, at CSKA Moscow. In 2004, he formally decided to travel far from home to move with his mother, to Moscow, Russia, at the time of his training, while his father, and older brother, Alexei, remained in Kazakhstan. Setting out in a country like Russia, where figure skating has supposedly a long-standing reputation for its distinctive sport, which would be a pretty fast and risky approach to training. It was also the point where could have been into the cause of his tragedy death. But it was a far cry from what he thought. That wasn't hard for him to train and experience a lot of things here. Russian coach Elena Bulyanova noticed that he is his progress process of skating skills, commented, quote, "He is skating beautifully, and he can interpret classical music and modern music. He dances very well, but at the same time, I think that he is technically very strong. There is this harmony within him, which I myself appreciate, and like in figure skating." After over a span of 5-year training in Russia, by 2010, Tin abruptly wound up in the US, where he would meet up with an American coach, Frank Carroll, who had then just coached Evgeny Sochi to the 2010 Olympic gold. While based in the US, the 25-year-old has spent most of his time adapting, after moving to the US, both in terms of training and life. Around this time, Tin finished 11th at the 2010 Vancouver Olympics, and 4 years later in Sochi, became the first skater from Kazakhstan to win an Olympic medal. He was then dogged by injury, but competed at the Pyeongchang 2018 Olympics, in Korea, where he was cheered by local fans, because of his Korean roots. At which he placed 27th at those games, after having only been able to train at low intensity, in the run-up. At this point, he was basically an eager trendsetter. Denis, furthermore, decided to mine different spheres: photography, writing, detailed project planning for his forthcoming future projects. It was clear enough for people that he was slowly shifting his skating career in a different direction.
I try myself, whenever I have free time. I have a certain schedule, how many hours I should train. Also there is time for my education. There is free time, which I like to devote to music, design. I like to design projects, like ice shows. This year I started to develop my first mobile application.
It's not so hard to realize that he was universally admired in the sport, and was a huge inspiration to so many aspiring young athletes, throughout his whole career. Everyone who knew him spoke highly of him, who described by his loved ones and colleagues, as the most warm, and humble, honest athlete they've ever seen in figure skating. But when Denis returned to a normal life, like many other athletes did, he had no way of knowing that it was about to be a fateful day in his final moments, right in his own homeland. It was a typical day like any other weekdays, in that nothing was out of the ordinary in Almaty, Kazakhstan. At around 10 AM, on July 19, 2018, he'd began the day with driving his white Lexus out for shopping, as his daily routine, and then leaving the shopping mall at 2 PM. He would later stop at the restaurant named Hedonist for lunch, by his two friends' appointment in Kurmangazi Street, and eventually pulling into a nearby parking zone, at the intersection of Kurmangazi and Bayzitova Streets, in Almaty, only a 40 meters away from the Hedonist. And then Denis entered the restaurant, where he would have a meal, and talking, laughing with his two friends, and even made a video which was posted on his social media platform, so that he shared it with everybody on there. Just less than 2 hours, before his brutal attack, without the knowledge that after that afternoon he'd never see his family ever again. The last video at midday is widely believed to have been taken at 2 PM, at which point, he was seen on Instagram joking around, and having fun with his two friends, in a private lunch at an expensive restaurant, in the heart of the Kazakh city of Almaty.
Тимати пригласил меня в свое заведение, своего лучшего мексиканского друга. Сделал мне мясо, рыбы и хороший.
К нам пришел парень, который очень хорошо пародирует девушек. Ладно, это просто Джеки. В гостях. Протеиновая, да.
Мексиканский стейк. Буррито.
Буррито.
Approximately an hour after the video was posted on his social media, Denis's meal had been looking uneventful as a whole. Here's what we know: sometime between 2:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, around this timeline, he noticed that his car alarm suddenly went off. Under the assumption that he would go out without any doubt, and just simply checked out what was going on with his car. With growing unease, Denis decided to walk out of the eatery, and heading to the parking zone for checking out if what's wrong with his car. And what happened next when he went outside? The terrible scene was that as soon as he walked out of the restaurant, he had seen two shady-looking men, hanging around his white Lexus, and making an attempt to steal mirrors from his car. Shortly after, the situation's sighting was out of beyond his control. Regardless of whatever risk would occur, at the time, he quickly handled it on his own, by rushing in pursuit of those two unidentified men. They, at this point, made a quick turn towards a nearby tennis court, only a 2-minute walk away. After a brief chase, Denis ended up having an encounter between these two thieves, which led to a fight broke out among him, and these two armed individuals. After a 5-minute cruel scuffle, they pulled out a knife from their backpack, approached from behind, and stabbed Denis 10 twice in the femoral artery, as he tried to fight against them. During this fight, according to some reports, that Denis 10 fell down onto the road, but he remains conscious with heavily stabbed wounds, and began bleeding profusely at the time. By this time, two thieves ran away from the scene, leaving bloody Denis alone on the road. But at least, he was alive at the time of murder. Shortly after that at 3 p.m., Denis is reported to have been seen by the passers-by, who immediately called an ambulance. Soon after, the first of the emergency response team arrived with multiple other police and ambulances arrived in, taking him to the hospital. After arriving at the hospital, he was completely unconscious, and couldn't breathe on his own. He underwent a 2-hour surgery, before suffering damage to the femoral artery, that led to massive blood loss. Despite the medical team's best efforts to save his life, Denis 10 went back into cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at 5 p.m. in hospital. Soon after, the police, and forensic investigators, arrived at the scene for imposing a lockdown, and gathering the evidences of after the accident. The sudden news of the death of Olympic figure skating medalist, Denis 10 came as shock to the nation, and his fans around the world. As a much beloved figure, affectionately coined, the Prince of Kazakhstan. His death sparked concerns, and the questions from both the public, and those close to the incident. Immediately, Kazakh news outlets chalked Denis 10's demise down as nothing but an accidental death. But who could have ever wanted to hurt someone like Denis 10, one of Kazakh's most famous figure skaters? The Kazakh police later got their hands on the single footage from a nearby security camera, showing how things can go seriously when two suspects are seen walking down, and promptly fled the scene after murdering Denis 10. With a suspicious look on their faces, but the strangest thing that there was no side view mirrors in their hands. It seemed like the whole plot was planned in the first place. According to some local witnesses at the scene, recalled the disturbing details of Denis 10's murder, that afternoon quote. One guy later told me that he was sitting in his car, and saw how 3 people started to fight. Then one of them fell down. He immediately left his car to provide help, and it was he who called an ambulance. He identified the figure skater, with help of the car's registration certificate. When the ambulance took him, his right leg was visibly swollen. It became swollen so fast, there was so much blood there, but nobody could have thought he would die. An investigation was launched, after Denis 10 was found seriously injured in Almaty downtown, at around 3 p.m. A short time earlier, he had been stabbed in the right thigh in Almaty. After arriving at the nearby hospital, it was clear that Denis' injuries were imminently life-threatening. According to the ministry's press service, that at the emergency room, he endured significant blood loss from his right thigh, and medics administered cardiopulmonary resuscitation for 2 hours, and in the end, he passed tragically away. In the hours following his death, external analyses were conducted on Denis 10, to confirm that there were many suspicious details related to his death. Kazakh law enforcement quickly concluded that Denis 10's brutal death was a homicide. However, this was only the beginning of a much bigger conspiracy. Just less than 24 hours after his tragic death, efforts to identify the suspects were confirmed. Kazakh authorities released a first photo of one of those detained as 24-year-old Nurali Kyasov. The young man comes from the remote village of Merk, which is a 5-hour drive from Almaty. But the second suspect was seen on CCTV, which was still on the loose, but afterwards he has been turning himself into the police. Later that same day, he was identified as 23-year-old Armen Kudayeverdinov, from the Kyzyl region. The Arabov was immediately taken to the crime scene by Almaty police officers, who have been investigating the tragedy. Investigators began questioning 2 detaining perpetrators, one of them, Nurali Kyasov, who claimed that during an altercation, they didn't recognize Denis 10, who was one of the most renowned skater in Kazakhstan. At the time of committing a crime, they had no choice but to fight against the skater who was chasing them, which even to the extent that they had threatened Denis 10 with a knife in self-defense, but had no intention to kill him. This cold, calculated response from these 2 perpetrators, who could do anything they wanted, without fear of any consequences. They didn't get how serious it is to take someone's life, and was ready to do anything to get what they wanted. Professional killers who are simply motivated by money, and the power they derive from the kill. In addition, there are one more potential suspect, in collusion with these 2 men in this case, which has been identified as Zanar Talibayeva. At the first hearing in a court, in the Specialized Inter-District Criminal Court of Almaty, 2 men accused of murdering the figure skater, Denis 10, was Armen Kudayeverdinov, and Nurali Kyasov, who didn't confess to murdering Denis 10. But the prosecution told in court how one of the men held 10, while another stabbed Denis 10 twice in the femoral artery. While denying the murder charge, the first defendant, Kudayeverdinov, just admitted to theft, and the second one, Kyasov, who the prosecution says is the one who stabbed Denis, pleaded innocent to both the murder and theft charges. Also in court was a female suspect, Zanar Talibayeva, charged by the prosecution as an accomplice to the theft, and failing to report a crime. She also pleaded not guilty at the time. "I did not know that my acquaintances had intentions of murder," Talibayeva was quoted as saying in her court testimony, by state news agency Kazakh. Looking at multiple crime databases, as Almaty Police Department detectives looked deeper into their past, it was clear that 3 perpetrators in Denis 10's murder, growing up in somewhat of a rough environment, in which none of them had steady jobs, and had countless legal problems for years, before being arrested. As for Kyasov, was known as a veteran gunfighter, and had a hobby was to brag about weapons, on social media as a trophy. In 2015, he was brought to administrative responsibility for drunk driving, and was also involved in a theft case, but it was closed due to reconciliation of the parties. some theories that thieves called in by a third party, conspiring to cause harm to Denis 10, or may have been paid by either officials, or authorities in Kazakhstan. To make sure that Denis is eradicated in a way that could easily be covered up by a car robbery. Rather, there must have been an instigator of the murder behind this case. So these three assassins would have followed Denis's every single move, and seeking a perfect moment to rush in committing the plan of the third party. It seems to find it very hard for these suspicions to ignore in Denis 10's mother, Oksana 10's next statements, that the day before the murder, these two assassins would drove to the center of the Chernyaerk city, and had rented an expensive apartment there, even though they have no money. But how could they afford to rent such an expensive apartment in Drvenskovo, Almaty, where is not a cheap district for a jobless underclass to rent? They should have stolen things even more expensive than the mirrors, like cash, wallet, car keys and the other items. But why they targeted car mirrors, which was only more ever regarded as commercially valueless stolen stuffs. With this realization, the thieves only had stolen the glass from the side mirrors of the Lexus GX 460, it was worth 10,000 rubles, which would be the equivalent of around $95. It turns out that the remarkably young athlete was killed for $95, so this robbery of $95 don't seem a very unlikely motive for a total robbery. What's even stranger is that the mirrors were left behind at the scene, with Denis's body covered in blood, but this is where their statements seem to be unreliable, to say the least. This could be a prearranged scenario from a third party. This level of planning suggested that the attack was premeditated rather than a spontaneous act of violence, after observing the scene for a while. On that very same Friday afternoon, which shows signs of Kazakh investigators pretending to be throwing the public off the scent, by knowing nothing of this potential suspect. And even nobody had enough suspicious to the two friends of Denis 10, in the restaurant, who didn't even get a mention in this case at the time. Despite they were one of the last eyewitness to see Denis 10 alive, only hours before he passed away. 10 was sitting at the same table having meal with two guys. All of a sudden, Denis walking out of the restaurant in doubt to check his car out, while two guys were still inside. No one has ever been able to confirm what exactly two friends of his was doing in 1 hour between when he left the restaurant, and never came back. Now here was where their movements get confusing in many ways. Why they were by then both seemed strangely disinterested in Denis 10's disappearance, for such a short period of time, and it has been theorized that his two friends had to know, at least something about the murder, and had questioned some inconsistencies in their stories. First off, the international media has long questioned how the murder of Denis 10 could have taken place without both of whom hearing anything. The more questions was as to whether they both were possibly accomplices, who behind the brutal death of Denis 10 or not. But investigators mostly ignored the presence of two accomplices in the case of Denis 10. In order to get a better understanding of conspirators' motive, we need to fast forward to the months before his death. He'd spend most of his time on his work all the time, had frequently been documenting his life on social media platforms. It was known that his schedule always seemed to be busy. On the 29th of June, 2018, Denis was invited to the official opening of the restaurant named Hedonist in Almaty, Kazakhstan for the first time, at which mostly was to invite their country's most well-known influencers for the opening, one of which was figure skater, Denis 10. As he came to the restaurant, it was surprised for Denis to realize that his classmate, Heruyev, who owns the Hedonist. After that meeting, the classmate, Heruyev, who went on desiring Denis to his restaurant for the next time, repeating over and over that he wants to treat Denis to a greater private meal, for some unknown reasons on the 18th of July. It was out of character for Denis 10's friend, Heruyev, who suddenly visited Denis's job site without warning, and asked Denis to lunch the next day, which fell on the 19th of July, 2018, to which Denis agreed, without any doubt at all. And the strange aforementioned act of the owner, obviously raised a lot of suspicion around Denis 10's death, was given in court by his mother. everything goes as planned on July 19, Denis 10 would head to the Hedonist, where would later lead to Denis 10's tragic death. Behind their appearance are troubling signs that Denis seemed not to know that they were having a dark plot that would tragically cut short Denis 10's life. It's nonsense to believe investigators refused to speculate on who was conspirator. So did authorities, and the media, upon ruining an investigation. It was believed the restaurateur, Heryev, had orchestrated the murder, with 3 other convicted criminals for Kazakh authorities. I'm a bit surprised people don't really bring this part up, as public interest had shifted more towards 3 suspects, than to Heryev, the restaurateur. In denying this motion, it's very likely that the murder scene was ever worse than what we've described, and worse than we might ever know the classmate. Heryev was always seeking ways to approach Denis in every way, shape and form. Most notably, ones in the restaurant who hadn't been taken in for questioning, nor had they brought up prosecution by Kazakh authorities and police, where it quickly became known that Denis had been suspected of foul play. By coincidence, the Hedonist restaurant, where Heryev, as the head of the restaurant, it has been permanently closed down in 2019, after a year of business, which later sparked waves of suspicion surrounding an actual criminal mastermind, was behind Denis 10's death, but regardless it was still somewhat of a suspicious action. The case reaching even deeper levels of weird, when authorities have intentionally ignored these conclusive evidences, as it went from assault case, to now a violent murder. Even, Ustamirov, the lawyer who represents Denis 10's mother, Oksana, also refuses to believe that this wasn't just an ordinary murder, it was supposedly a prearranged killing contract, which were systemically targeted by those who was involving intimidation, constant surveillance, and harassment. For this reason, it was then theorized the main individuals in this case were Nural Ikyasov and Armen Kudayebergenov, those who purportedly directly ended Denis's life. But the third accomplice, Xander Talabayeva, who had reportedly something to do with a relatively ignored suspect, Heryev, the restaurateur. Also, there's been reports, and statements, that she has a higher level of education than the other 2, as she was also known as a teacher, and was capable of speaking English, and Kudayebergenov is a thief who can remove a mirror. And he doesn't have enough brains for anything else, while Kyasov is a little smarter. While a few people have come forward to claim they saw Xander Talabayeva near the area where Denis 10 was killed, nothing conclusively points to a reason as to why she was in the area, or behaving erratically, as if she was in league with the restaurateur, Heryev. Upon giving signs of the active location, and the time when Denis would leave out the restaurant, and came up to his car, it implied a dark plan was drew up in details among them all, for murdering Denis 10 at the behest of a third party. After all, 3 perpetrators, and those who involved in the murder, were puppets who do what an organized group tell them to. But as famous as the case was, authorities had tremendous difficulty figuring out who was behind it. After brief superficial investigations, on January 14, 2019, Nural Ikyasov, convicted of murdering Kazakh figure skater, Denis 10, pleaded guilty to the crime. In addition to Ikyasov, Armen Kudayebergenov, and Xander Talabayeva, were also involved in the case. Nural Ikyasov claimed he tried to enlist Kudayebergenov's help, to set up a possible hit on Denis 10. And this was when he confessed to killing Denis. At one of the court hearings, Denis 10's mother reported strange calls from Europe that were received at Talabayeva's number. His mother asked the court to check the calls. But it seems the court, and authorities, have intentionally turned a blind eye to such an extremely vital clue, which made people seem to believe that the active Kazakh authorities showed signs of suspicious in this case. This would ultimately lead to the possibility of 3 accused having anything to do with Kazakh authorities, those who was behind his death as were part of a conspiracy to kill Denis 10. However, to be fair, the investigation didn't want to cooperate with the victim's family in the first place. Given the officials and authorities were all actively engaged in turning a blind eye to such crimes, in exchange for financial favors. During the trial, two defendants, Nurali Kyasov and Armen Kudayebergenov, confessed to committing this crime, and submitted material evidence. In particular, the defendant, Kudayebergenov, when verifying testimony at the crime scene, showed where a knife was hidden. It was confiscated, and included in the case files. They eventually pleaded guilty to the murder charges. The Supreme Court upheld the sentence of the convicts. On January 17, 2019, the two defendants, Armen Kudayebergenov and Nurali Kyasov, were found guilty of murdering Denis 10, and were sentenced to 18 years in a maximum security facility. In the case, the accomplice, Zanar Talibayeva, was also involved for failing to provide information about the crime to the authorities. Under the pressure from investigators, Talibayeva's defense team tried to argue that she was not intelligent enough to have planned such an elaborate scheme painting her as a pregnant woman, and was carrying Kudayebergenov's child. At the time of the murder, she was sentenced to 4 years in a medium security facility, but was released from custody a year later, in December 2019. The court decided to replace the remaining part of her sentence with a restriction of freedom due to her health condition, and the fact that she had given birth while in custody. She later returned to the colony, and was finally released in December 2021. But Denis 10's mother, Oksana, who was also in court, claimed that she disagreed with the judge's verdict, because there were many contradictions during the trial. She pointed out that Denis 10's murder was ordered by a motive on Kazakh government officials' part. It could have been covered up by a car theft, in any attempt to manipulate the international media. The plan had obviously gone into that attack. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment situation. It was so calculated. In fact, the particularly sensitive issue concerns, involved in contract killing for a third party in exchange for money, was disturbingly common in between Kazakhstan and Russia, which was understandably out to kill someone, as a part of revenge, in general are not above crime. Especially in countries with a long history of corruption, and politically unstable legal systems, the murder caused great outrage, leading to Kalmykambat Kasimov resigning from his position as the Interior Minister of Kazakhstan. The case suggests a cover-up by the authorities. Those who close to Denis 10 stated their desire to leave the country after his death.